Back to losing control. I think that's the point of the whole seminar, how to lose control. We have to consider pulsations. How many of you have put a fuel pressure sensor on the vehicle and looked closely at the fuel pressure without that signal being filtered and realized that it's real jittery and all over the place? It's a part of life. And probably the first thing you think if you see those pulsations is that I should put a fuel pressure damper on the system. And there's something that you need to know about those dampers. When the manufacturers put those on, they're designed around a specific frequency because they resonate at their own frequency. That damper does. Just like the car, you leave the springs on the car and take the shocks off and bounce it up and down, it'll bounce at that same frequency all day long. These spring-loaded accumulator-style pressure dampers work in exactly the same way. They are often tuned to a specific frequency, and the way they do that at the OE level, because they have all that money, is they'll perform various sweeps on the dyno. They'll do an FFT on the fuel pressure trace, which is a way of taking all this data and finding out its frequency content. And they'll look and say, oh my God, the system is a horrible resonance at 15 hertz, 22 hertz, whatever it is. And they'll tune these things specifically to deal with the problem. So what I want to tell you is that adding a fuel pressure damper does not always fix your problem. Now, the bad news is that what will always fix your problem is to do exactly what the auto manufacturers do. After you do a frequency analysis and you find out what the resonant frequencies are, then you tell the guy in the lab to design parts to kill exactly those frequencies. You don't have that option. Here's the good news. In most cases, when you build a high-performance car, you might pull those hard steel lines out of the car. Those hard steel lines, they don't give. The nylon lines don't give a lot either. You typically replace these lines with rubber. That rubber gives. You can feel it. Cars that idle, click, 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 it's got big injectors in it. You can feel that line pulsing a little bit. What that's doing is expanding and contracting as an accumulator on its own and smoothing out those pulsations. So what that is, what rubber fuel line is on a car is a poor man's pulsation damper. So by removing rubber and making all hard steel lines, you're killing that, and your pulsations are going to get more and more and more extreme. So I would love to tell you, I got this thing right here, I'm going to sell you, it's going to kill pulsations in your system, the life is going to be wonderful. It doesn't really exist because it's very frequency dependent. Best thing I can tell you is don't be afraid to use rubber fuel lines because they will do a big favor for you. Oh, I'll show you some of the pulsations in system on one of my own cars. The target pressure here is 43.5. The top graph is RPM, middle graph is throttle position, and the bottom graph is fuel pressure. It's unfiltered, and you can see that there's a lot of wobbling around in there. There's a lot of bouncing around. As bad as it looks, if you consider the actual range of those pulsations, it doesn't have much of an effect on the car. But it is not uncommon to pull a trace like this on some particular vehicle and see it swinging, 10 volts at full throttle. Oh, I'm sorry, 10 psi. Quite often, when that is the case, you'll find that there's a very specific RPM where that's a problem. Now, the good news is that that is normally easy to fix because it's caused by the next thing I'm going to show you. So, here's a picture of the last thing you expected to see in this seminar, a big pipe organ. Does anybody know how a pipe organ works? Doesn't matter, I'll tell you quickly. You simply blow air across the tube, and the air in the tube resonates at a specific frequency that is dependent on the length of the tube. By varying the length of the tubes, it changes the frequency of the sound that comes out. Now, you have a tube just like this on your car, most likely. If you're running a high boost application, you absolutely have a vacuum line or boost line between your fuel pressure regulator and your intake manifold. That line, or any piece of tubing, any length, will resonate at a frequency dependent on the length of that hose. So, does anybody know Tony Palo? Nobody knows Tony Palo? You work for him, you better know him. Tony's got a drag car. I won't go into the details about cars, it doesn't matter. He sent me a Motec log, had a bad fuel pressure pulsation at a specific frequency. To this day, he doesn't believe that I did this. And I looked at that. I did an FFT, which you could do an I2 Pro, which told me the frequency of the resonance. And I called him back and I said, is your fuel pressure regulator vacuum line, I think it was 18 inches long. It's about like that. Long you measured it, it was like 18 and a half or something like that. He said, how in the fuck did you know that? So I had to go through the whole organ pipe theory thing, and here's essentially what happened. Pulsations from the manifold were exciting the air in that tube, and so that air, basically that pulsation was affecting the diaphragm on the fuel pressure regulator, and at that RPM, the fuel pressure would just go crazy, bouncing around, and then it would settle back down on the other side of it. What we've got here is 3 lines that represent a 4-cylinder, a 6-cylinder, and an 8-cylinder engine, and I have to specify them differently because for a given RPM, they all have a different firing frequency, obviously, we all know that. And so what we're looking at here is the hose length in inches and the corresponding RPM that will have a firing frequency that corresponds with that. So if you had a 20-inch long hose between the intake manifold and the fuel pressure regulator, you would find that on an 8-cylinder engine, that would resonate at about 2,500 RPM. On a 6-cylinder, about 3,500 RPM, and on up the scale. So what you see there is that if that hose is very short, the natural resonant frequency of that organ pipe that we call our boost hose is so high that it's well out of the operating range of the engine. So the short story is this: don't put a long hose on the fuel pressure regulator if you can avoid it. More importantly, definitely don't do it to your map sensor. You want to see some ugly map sensor signals in a car, you can play the same game. I can look at that and get on my calculator and say, hey, I bet it's this long, isn't it? And you'll find that that same resonance is set up there. That'll make some crazy things happen. You can either do all the math, if you're a geek like me or like Jay, he's kind of a geek too, or you can just keep the hoses short enough that they're out of the running range of the engine and not have to worry about it. This is one of those things that seems like a good party trick. That's actually a real problem that occurs often. If you see a very specific resonance in manifold pressure or fuel pressure that is at a specific RPM and goes away on either side, you have a resonance, typically an organ pipe resonance. It's possible that it's in the fuel system. However, it's somewhat unlikely because the speed of sound through our gasoline is so fast that the resonant frequencies are naturally very high. It's going to be typically in something that has air in it where we see this. And that's where it ends up. Happens on the map sensor, happens on the fuel pressure regulator. So there you go. One way to diagnose a problem, something's been plaguing you, and know exactly how to get rid of it. Not to mention the first time you do it and tell somebody, they're going to scratch their head and wonder, what is this? Where did he come up with that? So search it out. It's a handy thing. By the way, I have on a particular car actually fixed an RPM-dependent misfire due to this exact problem. That's how extreme it can be. It's dependent on the regulator or on your map sensor, depending on how much it's filtered, depending on where it is. Point is, it's a problem. It's another way we can lose control. So basically, as I think about it now, I should have changed the name of this seminar to How to Instill Fear in All